This is Audiommunity, a podcast about our body's never-ending fight with the outside world. Hi, this is Audiommunity, episode 50, recorded on December 16th, 2025. I'm Kevin Bonham, assistant professor at Tufts Medical Center, joined as always by Matt Woodruff at Emory.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going. It's the end of the year here, and we don't have a paper today. We're going to sort of do episode 51 and last recording of the year. Feels like a nice time for a retrospective. We were just talking a little bit before we started recording, sort of thinking about what we've done on Audiommunity and what we would like to do going forward. And so we sort of wanted to just like kick around some ideas. And one of the main things is that our audience is very small. So one question is like, how much effort do we want to put into expanding that audience? If you are one of our small number of listeners, we would love to hear from you. contact@audiomunity.org. But yeah, I think just generally we wouldn't just sort of talk back about what we've done and where we're going, whether this is, you know, what parts of this are worth continuing, if there's anything new we should be doing, and that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I mean, I was sort of reflecting on, I mean, it's been 10 years, really, right? So we've been recording now over a pretty broad time frame.
Yeah, more than 10 years. Our first episode was January 30th of 2014.
Yeah. And actually, I brought something to share.
Oh.
Yeah. Of course, I didn't...
Matt's making some fun faces here on the video.
Yeah.
Oh, you were going to share your screen?
I was going to try to do that, and it would appear that I can't do that. And my computer now has freaked out.
Magic of audio recording. We are back after Matt did not solve his technical problems, but shared images with me. And actually, you should have checked to make sure that I could actually share my screen. Let's share the entire screen. This will be fun. Do a little infinite regress.
Pretty close to where we.
Can you see my screen at the moment?
No.
No, there it is.
There we go. Yep. Now I'm recursive in like 6 places.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Yep. So these are images of who we were a long time ago. When Audiommunity first started. So this is about 2013, 2014. And yep, that's me upside down in a bouldering room at the time. And if you go
underneath the dorms at Harvard Medical School.
That's true.
Where we were at grad school.
Yep. A lot of tape on the walls. Much of it I put there.
Yeah.
And then, Kevin, this is you.
Yeah.
Yep.
God, I was young.
Yes. You look like a baby in that picture. Yeah. So,
out at a farm where we went to pick groceries or pick vegetables.
We did. It was a very
at a
picking
place
adventure.
that we had farm share.
Yeah.
I should pull up. Well, I'll cut some of this as I. Oh no, I don't. I'm not even signed in here. No, I'm not going to bother.
Yep.
I was going to say we've got hiking. Matt and I used to go hiking in the winter up on mountains, and almost died.
Yes.
At least twice on Flume specifically.
Yeah. Fuck Flume.
Yeah, fuck Flume. Maybe in fact that's our episode title. But yeah, I think when we started this, I think there weren't a lot of examples of science communication in public that was for other scientists. There were a couple of podcasts, like obviously This Week in Virology, This Week in Microbiology have been going for a while. But there weren't a lot of examples of that, and the examples that did exist were of much more senior people than we were, that were sort of far along in their careers already, mostly tenured professors, and so we thought we were in graduate school or just finishing up graduate school, and we thought that there was a sort of lack of perspective of that early career scientist. And I think that's largely still the case. Obviously, we're more advanced now in our careers than we were then, but we're still very early on in the tenure track lifestyle. And I think there still isn't a lot of that perspective available.
Yeah.
Sort of thinking about doing science and what it means to do science as a career this early on, and especially now, I think things are changing so much. I mean, even in the early 2010s when we started, things had already changed a lot from the 80s and 90s when a lot of current professors had trained. But I think now in our current environment, it's even more tumultuous than it was then.
So from a technology perspective, right? So we were coming out of grad school at a time when transcriptomics was like bulk transcriptomics. Was hot, right? So what's the project out of the Benoit Mathis lab? We use it all the time. Basically just mapping transcriptomes of sorted cells, right? And so that was all bulk transcriptomics. Single cell transcriptomics, I'm sure, was being sort of developed at an academic level, but really wasn't commercially available
well,
in any
I think
way yet.
People were doing transcription, people were doing gene expression for microarrays for a lot of graduate school, right? That was still de rigueur in terms of, like, if you want to measure gene expression, you put your RNA on a plate that had probes in little cells. You washed your RNA over it, and the binding strength of transcripts to that little spot on the microarray, which you had to know ahead of time what you were looking for, that's how you measured transcription. So doing transcriptomics with sequencing, where you just sequence all the RNA that's present, that was pretty brand new as we were coming towards the end of graduate school. And even microarray technology, compared to 10 years before, when you had to pick each individual gene and do a qPCR, that seemed magical, that you could do thousands of transcripts at once.
Yeah, and it was. I don't know. I guess it is hard to describe to folks outside of this field just how different a 20-year gap looks, right? The pace at which technology has accelerated over the course of just recording this podcast over 10 years is nuts. It's absolutely nuts. It's like an entirely different level of investigation. I would go, a good way of talking about this maybe is what a bioinformatician was and did in 2014 when we were first starting this podcast. There was a really good reason that people started training heavily in bioinformatics, and it's because there was no previous connection really between bench science and the informatics world. Right. So software development was sort of its own thing, and certainly it had its place in biology. Right. There was software development
goes back to the 70s and 80s, the algorithm developers. BLAST, I think, was late 90s. And I think.
And it was its own thing.
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
It was its own, and biologists maybe had a couple people that could every once in a while speak that language, or at least make contact with the people that did, and those were that were really on the cutting edge, right? Found ways to get informaticians and biologists sort of in the same space, and that was really cutting edge. And now, literally everything that we do in the lab requires, at least in my lab, requires some level of informatics expertise, right?
Yeah.
Every single experiment is now high dimensional, right? Whether it's flow cytometry, whether it is spatial transcriptomics, whether it is single cell biology, all of those things, to the point where you get to a place where if you are not willing to learn those tools, you're really hamstrung. Actually, now as a bench scientist,
for sure. I mean, I think you then need to have access to a core facility or something where people are gonna, and then you have to pay people to take the time to learn your stuff. Like it used to be, when I was in graduate school, like for flow cytometry, like obviously there were a lot of people that knew how to do flow cytometry, at least a little bit. There was one fax machine on the floor, and if I wanted to sort cells, I had to go across to a different hospital and like sign up with their core facility. I ran like 2 flow experiments myself, but I was dependent on others to like order the reagents and tell me how to do the gating strategy and stuff like that. I feel like you can still do that with computational stuff these days, but you're dependent on others in order to be able to do that. If I bet John has some projects in his lab. My PhD advisor, John Kagan, probably has some projects in his lab that are still primarily like cell and biochemistry and like, but I would guess it's the minority. And I think across most labs, like if you're writing an R01 these days, I think if you don't plausibly have the ability to, analyze a single cell RNA-seq data set, like you're going to be very limited in terms of what you can do.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's like the primary tools that we had are now secondary cleanup and confirmation tools. Right? Like there are absolutely things that cannot be done with single cell transcriptomics or epigenomics or any of those things. And a lot of them are really important, actually, right? But those techniques tends now to be relegated to after you've done the major experiment, right? So you find the pathway that you're interested in, and then you sort of clean up with these more traditional assays. So anyway, we don't have to shake our canes at technology progress. I mean, this is the business, but I would say that the business has accelerated drastically, and I think it's important to remember too, and it's an interesting bit of retrospective, is that this business of science is not that old, right? We tend to think of it as this institution that has been around forever, and at some level it has, right? People have been doing science a long time, but for a very long time it was sort of the gentleman scientist.
Yeah,
right?
it was not a profession. It was
Correct.
a pastime.
Yes.
And there were folks in the aristocracy that were like would write treatises and would send letters to the Royal Society in London. And if you had enough money, you could buy your, so in microbiology, the sort of like first microbiologist is considered Antony von Leeuwenhoek, who was this guy in Delft, Holland, who like made these really amazing microscopes and was the first to like look at pond water and see little things moving around. He looked in his saliva, he looked at semen, he looked at like all of these different things, just documenting and writing down what he saw under the microscope. Dude was rich because he was a merchant. He was like, his job was buying and selling stuff, and he was in a trade capital, and like that's how he had money to go buy his like fancy glass and grind his lenses, and had the free time to do that. That was the 17th century, but I think that was still true through most of the 18th century. In the 19th century, you started to get like some chemists that were like mostly making dyes for textiles, but they were kind of experimenting with, they were sort of like thought like, oh, this little side business in alchemy, trying to turn lead into gold, and like trying out these various things. But it's really not until after World War II, and especially in the U.S., where you have the government basically made a deal with universities to say, we are going to fund research, fund academic science.
At a basic level.
Right, at a basic level to drive innovation. And the deal was, you're going to get the smartest people to work really hard for not that much money, and we are going to be the center of innovation for the world.
Right. And not,
for a relatively small investment, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's millions of dollars, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of several decades. And also, like, I can't remember what the numbers are, but if you look at, like, Nobel Prizes in physiology and medicine, you look at Nobel Prizes in chemistry and physics, like, the percentage that comes out of the U.S. is, like, vastly disproportional. And it's because we made this deal in the 20th and early 21st century.
Yeah, I'm missing the guy's name. There was an architect of all of this. And I will have to go back and find it. We'll have to put it in the show notes. But I mean, this was all very intentional, as you just pointed out. And, not for the good of the world, right? Not because science is cool. It was a defense decision, right? It was very, very clear after World War II that, the ability of the United States to develop the atomic bomb before anyone else was an extraordinarily important defense strategy, right? And it became clear, I think, to folks at the government level and also at the university and scientific level that having sort of the front line of basic investigation at a scientific level was a really important defense strategy across the U.S. And so that was, up until very, very recently, the prevailing understanding of why it is that this relationship has sort of existed. Now, unfortunately, we've had enough what's good in 2025s to know that perhaps that's being shaken a bit. Perhaps that sort of symbiotic relationship is not quite as clear to the government, at least, as it was. And to be honest with you, to be really, really frank, I don't know that it's all that clear to the scientific community anymore. Yeah. That it needs to understand that, there was a very specific reason that investment happened, right? And sometimes I think, and it's important, right? Like part of that pact was that you were going to unleash the scientists, and then you were not going to get in their way. And it was important that you didn't get in their way. It was important that the government was not going to tell scientists what to do, right? That was a part of it. But again, that was to an end. And I think it's important sometimes that we step back as scientists as well and think to ourselves, like, that end was ultimately the best interests of the United States government and its population. And you and I both know that I've advocated in the past, very much like we do on this podcast, for scientists to be able to relate what it is they're doing in the broader scheme of, like, how is science developing? How is this helping our understanding of the world? How is it ultimately helping humanity? Because those things are real and tangible. They're important. It is not the case that the end here is that we all sit around in our labs feeling good about the basic science that we do, right? Like, although I like it, it's a great job, but it's not really the point.
Vannevar Bush is the name of the guy that you were trying to figure out, who sort of architected the. And there's a great series of podcasts. I'll put this in the show notes as well. By this podcast On the Media, they sort of partnered with the Boston Globe. There's a podcast series. It's just like 3 episodes called The Harvard Plan, and they sort of detail this history of the 1950s of sort of how the research establishment was built in this country. And I think one thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind as scientists as we talk through this stuff is, like you said, it's not obvious to the public why it's useful. We can cite statistics all the time about like how like $1 of research funding generates X number of dollars in, economic activity and all of that stuff.
And it does.
But I think it's also important that we remember, like all institutions, science, structural science, sort of professional science, there are lots of problems. And it is not that the current way that things are funded is some optimum, right? It is not as if you can't find examples of, misspent money or, even fraud, things like that. Like, all of these things exist. But the question, I think, ultimately is, on balance, is the money invested worth it to the broader society? And I think the answer is like pretty obviously yes.
I mean, it has to be, right?
Especially if you look at like the improving lifespan. You look at all of these again, like there are problems in medicine. There are issues with how research is done, how much is captured by big pharmaceutical companies, and like issues with patents and drug trials. All this stuff is like, obviously there are problems, and also like we have driven so much innovation, so much that we now know that we didn't know, and that we wouldn't know if everything was for profit. So yeah, I mean, I find it a little bit hard to articulate in a short period of time just how impactful. I mean, again, it's a relatively small amount of money. I mean, it sounds big. You said like the NIH budget is what, like $35 billion a year or something like that. But like, compared to defense spending, compared to like even interest on the debt, I think it's a fraction of government expenditure. It creates not only all of our jobs in academia, but also, as we talked about, a few months ago, when a lot of the stuff around NIH funding and indirects were coming through, like it funds the research enterprise at universities, which also funds lots of science equipment startups, and it funds people that are supplying all the pipettes and all of the microscopes and reagents, and it funds this giant economy of innovation
and healthcare, right?
And
because all
doctors
of these universities, are also your premium healthcare, high end technology universities, right? So you can talk about any number of things. We could talk about cancer checkpoint inhibitors. We could talk about, prevention of HIV globally now with a 6 month, once every 6 month shot recently, right? These are things that have developed over the last decade, really, that you could point to. But a really recent one is CAR T therapy in autoimmunity, and we haven't really talked about that yet, which is shocking because I am pretty embedded in that space. But CAR T therapy right now in the autoimmune space is being discussed as a potential functional cure for autoimmune disease across a number of different modalities, right? Lupus, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, right? Like, there are a number of different diseases out there that right now are under clinical investigation for anti-B cell CAR T therapy. And I mean, we're not there yet. The large clinical trials have not been done, but the anecdotal evidence has been building now for years that this might actually be a real thing, right? It could be that many autoimmune diseases that were out of reach for us are no longer out of reach. Here's the catch. Those therapies are wildly complicated. You have to take somebody's blood, extract T cells, engineer those T cells, and then reinfuse those T cells back into the patient, right? So that requires a high-level infusion lab, an immunology lab, and genetic engineering lab that can take care of those samples, right, at a high enough quality that then you can confidently put it back into that patient, right? This is only being done at high-end universities. There is no rural hospital that is capable of doing this. None, right? It is impossible. And that won't always be the case, right? It won't always be the case because we're doing cool things like nanoparticle development, where maybe we can transform T cells in the body into these things without having to extract them. But the only reason that that will happen is because we will have spent a decade at these high-end research universities having done the really hard work of figuring out how these therapies actually operate, right?
Well,
and it
and
is
not to
impossible
mention
to get to the end of that without the beginning. Right?
And not to mention that the understanding how to engineer a receptor on a T cell, there are grants that were funded at NIH in the 90s that had words like, understanding sick phosphorylation in, whatever the hell, because there's this one enzyme in T cells that is critical to phosphorylate the specific domain of some receptor. And we have to understand structurally all of those things. And if you go back and look at the history of papers, the history of grants that funded the work in those papers, a big story that's come out recently that I think is illustrative, but is by no means unique, is this idea that all of these GLP-1 drugs that are, they're being touted for weight loss but more importantly, helping folks with type 2 diabetes, with metabolic disorders. They seem to have effects on cancer. They seem to be sort of just extremely useful. Those came initially, people figured that out because of something in the saliva of Gila monsters. That these particular lizards were able to live for very long periods of time without eating. And somebody was interested, how are they able to do that? And so that basic research, now gets us to this point where we have these wildly, important drugs for health, but also, wildly lucrative for the pharmaceutical companies that are commercializing these. And I think that's a very sort of cogent example, but it is every single new drug has a history that is not dissimilar to that. Even thinking about AI, the computer science that funded this work out of the NSF, people have talked about the internet, starting from ARPANET, and so much of what we take for granted in our world that have made these wildly successful companies that are huge drivers of the economy and of culture and of society, those were initially funded by government, and they were unlikely to have been funded by commercial companies because the commercial outcomes were not clear, could not have been foreseen, and they wouldn't have. A company that had invested in those things would not have survived long enough, right? It requires decades-long investment in basic science, and it just doesn't work on the time scale of markets. So,
no. And so I think that we've put together at least a brief 20-minute defense of why science is important, and it's I think obvious why science communication then has to be important. Right? Because, like you said before, it is not, if you don't understand the system, inherently obvious as to why you would need to spend that 10, 20-year runway continuing to invest in folks that may or may not always seem completely productive until, this one thing comes up that turns out to be actually very, very important in some future time. Like it is hard to conceptualize what that time frame looks like. And I think that this was sort of the reason that the system was set up the way that it was set up. Getting back to Bush, is you really do need scientists sort of running that show, right? Because it's fine to do something like an HIV push, right? Like something comes up and you say, okay, well, we're just going to pour a bunch of money into this specific problem. It works, sort of, but it only works if you have the backbone to do it already, right? If the surrounding understanding of retroviruses, for example, is sufficient to understand the nature of the problem that you're tackling, if the understanding of DNA polymerases, right, is enough to help you contextualize what might be running differently in an HIV infection. Only enough if you understand the T cell biology so that you know how the infection is progressing and you can track it in a reasonable way, right? Like these things are not independent of the background work constantly going on. You just hope to build on that background work in a very specific way. And I think that this is one of the fundamental misunderstandings of sort of how the current MAHA movement, for example, sees science. Science can't be that directed. You simply can't do it effectively. What you end up doing is wasting a ton of money on a lot of people that all have the same idea. And then the idea turns out to be maybe not the one that you would have pursued, right? Now you can
I'm going to take exception even to the term wasting, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
Because
what you end up with... sorry, go ahead.
No, you invest, like... It's so funny because there's, these people that are often lionized by the same group of people that will crap all over this idea of science funding are fine with venture capitalists investing in 100 companies, only one of which is going to turn out to be a profitable investment, because they recognize that if you knew ahead of time which ideas were going to pan out, then you wouldn't need, like, investing would be easy, right? So, like, these venture capitalists that have all this clout and think they're so great because, they got lucky betting on PayPal or whatever, like, they seem fine with the idea that they're going to invest in a bunch of companies that are going to fail because they don't know which ones are going to succeed. That's what we do in science. We invest in a lot of ideas. The difference in science is that all of the things that we invest in almost always are generating some knowledge. We don't know which of those bits of knowledge are going to go into a blockbuster therapy, but very little money that is spent through these granting mechanisms is legitimately wasted, right? It's being spent to train new generations of scientists. We have a huge biomedical workforce in the country that are, PhD students, undergraduates, postdocs that are going to companies, pharmaceutical companies, that are driving research in those companies to generate breakthroughs. So there's the training aspect, not to mention training all of the MD, PhDs, the physicians that are going to go on to treat patients. They're doing experiments that are generating knowledge that are going into papers. I could do a whole rant on why the scientific publishing industry is a problem. I've talked about that 10 years ago in Audiommunity. A lot of those problems still exist and have even gotten worse in some cases. But most of the money that is invested is going into generating new knowledge, some of which is just basic, this is useful to know. Some of it is going to go to breakthrough therapies. And And again, like the amount of money that's actually being spent is remarkably small.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
All of this is just to generate little clips that we can put on TikTok to grow our audience.
Well, and so I was just thinking. I mean, so if clearly the question is not whether science should exist, it should. It's not whether to communicate science effectively to the public. It's clear that it needs to, right? Because when you lose trust in that system, we have seen what happens. So, the question then becomes, and I think this is the question in front of Audiommunity is, okay, well, then what does that communication need to look like? And I would argue that when we started this podcasting was probably the front edge of what science communication could look like. I think that we got into it, and the audience at that time, we were tooling around a lot, right? We were making illustrations and videos and those sorts of things, and really trying to work up a digital presence for immunology, and it felt forward thinking. And I guess the question in front of us is whether that is currently the edge of where science communication needs to be, whether that's one part of it, whether there are other pieces like you just mentioned. Can we, talk about the business of science in a way that's digestible, that people clearly don't understand right now, right?
Yeah.
Is there something other than the long form that will help us get there? I think these are all things that, we need to be exploring and experimenting with, right? Because that is the nature of what we do.
Yeah, but I think we also need to sort of think about where do we add value? Because there are science journalists who have sort of broad expertise. They don't have the same training that we do, but their job is to bring science to the public. And for all we often, I guess not on this podcast, but certainly in private, we talk about the ways in which science journalists can misstate, or the framing is something we wouldn't agree with, but their job is to communicate scientific discoveries to the public, and the vast majority of the time they do a great job.
Yeah, they're frequently good at it.
And we are not trained as journalists, so we're not gonna be able to provide that same kind of service. I think the value that we add is that we know what it is like to be in a lab. We know what it is like to try to drive these projects forward. We have some sense, although frankly far less than I would like at this stage in my career, of applying for grants and knowing how to secure money to do this work. So the model that we started with and that we still largely do is that of a journal club, which is something that most labs do at least some of the time, where everybody reads a similar paper. They all come together to talk about the results. And, I do a lot of reading, again, not as much as I would like, on my own, but there's a very different sense of a paper that I can get just talking to even one other person about that. And Matt and I were doing this before we decided to start doing this again. Matt and I were talking pretty constantly about various ideas, various projects, various papers. So we're going to do this. We're going to have these conversations whether or not we're recording it, right? So the question is what can we add? What is putting these videos, these audio files on the internet? How does that add value to scholarship, to general public, to trainees, to graduate students, postdocs that are listening, right? What is the impact that we can have when we don't just talk about this on the phone between one another?
Yep.
And if that means going to TikTok, by God, Matt will post to TikTok. I'm not gonna.
Yeah, Matt
I
might
refuse to put
have
it
to
on my
figure
phone.
out how to post to TikTok for other reasons. got a couple things to get out into the world in that space. But yeah, no, I completely agree. I think, yeah, value added is always where this is. And it certainly is a lot of fun to hang out and talk about papers. So like you said, we will continue to do that. And we've done it 50 times now. There's like, what, 100 hours of content probably of Audiommunity, which is a lot of content.
Yeah, I could go calculate it if we needed to. Yeah. But it's a lot. Yeah. So our first episode, I was just pulling this up. So our first episode was in January of 2014. I defended my thesis April of 2014. We actually put out a podcast in April as well. We were doing pretty good about once a month. Mm-hmm. Took a few little breaks and hiatuses. 2015, we had 6 episodes. 2016, we had like maybe 10 episodes. 2017, we only had 3.
Yeah. So you know what happened in 2017?
You had a baby.
Charlie was born.
Yeah. Interestingly, prior to that, we had an episode called Matt Got Married, and we're talking about pregnancy. That was in December of 2015. So you took a few years to make good on that.
Yeah, true.
But, yeah, and then we took a very, very long break.
Yes.
So our last recording in what we were calling season 1 of Audiommunity finally came out on August 20th of 2018, which is actually later than I would have thought. We managed to keep things going, changed up the hosts a few times, and then we didn't go again until January of this year, of 2025. Obviously, a lot of things happened. I had some babies. COVID happened. We were both working on our postdoc careers, which I don't know if you agree with this, but I think is probably the hardest period scientifically so far. I mean, graduate school, it felt like not much responsibility. Yeah. Sort of obvious that if I wanted a postdoc, I could get one. I sort of futzed around with a couple of different kinds of postdoc positions. But yeah, the period of postdoc was probably the most challenging in terms of like needing to spend time on doing science and also thinking about careers. And now I've only been an assistant professor for a short time, and I've sort of haven't been as productive as I might like, but it still feels more stable than postdoc position felt.
Yeah, no, postdoc is game time. Yep. If you are listening to us and wondering if you're going to be a scientist, you've got about 5 years, 6 years to show it, right? Because very few people prove out of their PhD. Yeah, sure. Kevin's flashing 10. It's hard. It's hard because, and I've talked about this before, but there's an expiration date on sort of that postdoc space, and it's because there are a lot of early career investigation kinds of things that begin to expire, and if you haven't hit certain metrics, you're less and less likely for somebody to take your faculty application seriously. And yeah, there's stuff that you got to get done. As a postdoc, you're not credible yet coming out of your PhD, and yeah, it sucks actually. Postdocs suck, but if you want it, that's where you show you want it, I suppose.
Yeah, and it should be said, a lot of people who want it still and work to show it still don't do it. I'm actually on a search committee right now, and I feel so bad looking at these applications, like remembering what it was like to send these applications out, and the things that I'm doing to triage. Like, it feels terrible.
Yeah. No, but I mean,
we've got 150 applications for one spot.
Yep.
And many of them are extremely excellent. Nature papers, science papers, neuron papers, cell papers, they've got K99s, they've got F32s, they've got all of this, they've got funding, they've got manuscripts, they've got papers in good journals, they've got excellent mentoring. And it's 100 applications. It's more than 100 applications for one spot.
Yes. Yep. And very few people are hiring because the NIH has fallen on its face.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a bummer.
So what are we doing? So I think we've talked a little bit about the past. We've sort of talked conceptually about what the importance of science and science communication. Specifically, what do we want to do? So, for me, the things that I would like to work on for 2026 are expanding our audience. We say at the end of every episode, the most important thing you can do is share with your friends. That works up to a point, but it only works if people actually do it. And I don't think enough of you have been doing it. Or if you are, then your friends are not continuing to do it. So get on them.
So our strategy is going to be literal finger wagging.
Damn it, get on the social medias. So we're thinking, how much of this, all of these podcasting platforms, Riverside, which we use to record, they generate all these short clips using AI. We don't post those now. All of the big podcasts do that. Is that helpful? I think I'm going to share my little rant about NIH and why it's important, maybe, on YouTube. Is that going to move the needle? Matt's going to go sign up for TikTok. And he's going to post there. Right, Matt? Wagging my finger at Matt now.
That's going to figure out what TikTok is.
Yeah. Get your burner phone so that the Chinese don't...
Right. What I need is to go get my encyclopedia.
Your Prince encyclopedia off the shelf.
That's exactly right. T for TikTok.
Yep. But really, there must be some new thing that we don't know about, because we're the olds now, right? It seems like there's probably something that hasn't been written about in the New York Times yet that's what actually the young people are using. Provide us feedback. Let us know what that is. Contact at audiommunity.org.
Honestly, I think the folks that are listening are an important part of the conversation. It is a struggle to know exactly where you are the value added outside of the specific field that you're in. I think Kevin and I both know exactly where we fit into the science ecosystem, right? Because we've spent the last 15 years figuring that out. It's harder to know when you're talking to a broader audience. So if there are suggestions, thoughts, wild thoughts even, about where our understanding of all of this could be useful, please do let us know.
Yeah. And I think, we're going to keep doing this. I was saying to Matt before we pressed record that, Matt and I are going to keep chatting. We're probably going to have very similar conversations between one another, even if we're not recording. The big question is whether it is worth the time and effort to edit and post these things, which, in the grand scheme of things, is not all that much effort. And on the other hand, that's time I could be spending writing another NIH grant that's destined to fail. So, if you're listening and you find any value in these conversations, please reach out, let us know. I don't know if there's anything else that we want to touch on. We can give our typical links. I think we have a small community on Patreon that has been supporting us, and I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I think that it is small enough and it is enough effort to... there's additional added effort to post everything to Patreon every time I post an episode. And I think that it makes sense to ask those folks if they'd be willing to go to a different service that doesn't require that I continue posting to a third place, right? Because right now I'm posting to our website, audiomunity.org, AUDIOMMUNITY.org. I'm also posting videos to YouTube. And I'm posting to Patreon at the moment. I think I want to cut one of those out because it is added effort of, just copying and pasting and making sure that the dates line up and all that stuff. And it's trying to reduce the barriers to do that. If that would be a problem for you, or if you think like, actually, I would donate on Patreon, but not elsewhere, do let us know. If you have ideas for episodes, topics that you want covered, if you think we should be doing more like, less journal clubby things and more advocacy / telling stories from science, let us know that as well. We've had a couple of guests in the past couple of months. We're going to hope to continue to do that, bring new perspectives on the show. Hopefully they'll share with their friends and expand our audience that way. It is not entirely, but at least partially cynical, this effort. But really, I think, one of our goals, because, as we said earlier, a lot of the podcasts in this space are senior people. They have one perspective. We think it's valuable to get the perspectives of younger folks. We had the student from Emory that came on talking about his science advocacy. We've had a couple of other assistant professors come on and talk about their work or related work. And we've got a few folks in the queue for next year to talk about their early trainee work. So if you have other ideas for that, or if you'd like to come on the show, be a guest, talk about your work, that would be great. Reach out. Again, contact@audiomunity.org. You can find links on our website, audiomunity.org. Subscribe. Rate us on iTunes if you listen there, or Stitcher, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Anything else that you want to say, Matt?
No, I don't think so. We'll see you next year.
All right, see you next year. Happy holidays, everyone. Music at the beginning and the end is composed by Rachel Reinick, and we'll see you next time.
Sometimes you get lucky.